Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 175, and I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by Lorena Sumser. Lorena is the S&C coach and sports therapist at Bayern Munich. So, Lorena, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
It's great to have you on. I know we've got a few different topics lined up to talk about, so I'm keen to get into those. But I've just mentioned your current role, Lorena, but can you take us back? Can you give us a little bit of a history lesson on yourself, where you've been, what you've been up to?
Oh boy, well, where to start? So first of all, I do not have like a bachelor or whatever in sports and exercise or whatever you call it in English. So I got a bachelor's in health management actually, and just from there, because here in Germany, I did it's kind of a two-way kind of thing. So you have a bit of a practical thing, so where you full-time work and then you study next to it. And because I did that in a physiotherapy, I just got more and more into this training aspect of things, and I kind of stayed and educated myself more for more in training and what I want to be as a coach, because I also I'm super active myself. I'm been playing sports my whole life, so I just wanted to work more and more on that. And then I got lucky to grab the role at Bayern and to also work at a physiotherapy too, and just develop my life from there. Yeah, and currently I'm working, and sometimes I play football, as you British people call it. So I might slip a soccer every now and then, but I'm apologizing in advance for
that. No, brilliant. Now, you just mentioned that you are quite active and you compete in different sports. Do you want to give us a little bit more information on that? Because that's gonna be the first pathway we go down in terms of some of your background.
So, well, let's start. I mean, I grew up in the countryside, so basically doing everything. I grew up doing everything, but what's probably the most influential to me in my life is kind of my skiing history. So my dad's a ski instructor, and he kind of probably put me on ski before I could even walk. So yeah, that influenced me through my whole life. Basically, we were always up skiing in the mountains outside, and just as whole skiing environment is just so different from probably every other sport that I did before, like any other team sport or whatever, just by the work ethic and how things usually work on a slope or in a ski resort. So yeah, and then obviously I did a lot with balls. I grew up playing basketball, always kicking a soccer ball with the boys, and yeah, so that's basically it. And now I kind of stayed, it's kind of trying to fit it in every now and then, and yeah.
Brilliant. And I always like going into topics like this with people that have had slightly different backgrounds, or they've been involved in different sports maybe. And with skiing, I can't really remember anyone that's been on the podcast before that's talked about that. I might be wrong. But I always like asking, when people are from a slightly different background, your takeaways. You've just mentioned the sort of work ethic that goes into skiing and preparation for skiing. But is there anything that you implement in your current role with the players that you think has come from that sort of background?
Yeah, what I really try to get going with the girls is just that mindset that you just learn to trust your own abilities first, and then you trust the team. Because obviously, I mean, you have a team around yourself in ski racing, for example, but in the end, it's just you on the track or on the racetrack, or you on the slope. So you are responsible for everything you do there. You're responsible for all the mistakes, for you flying into the air and crashing, or you're also responsible for having the greatest run of the day, and just that awareness that you are the one being responsible for your own actions is something I really want to push with my girls, especially now that they're under 17. They're growing up, and they're kind of sometimes hiding behind the fact that they're in a team sport. And I mean, of course, you have a team, you work with the team, so it's not just only you, but just that thing that it's you in the first place and then the team in the second place. That's the one thing that I really want to push. And when you are like, when an athlete is confident in their own abilities, and is sure about their abilities, then they work better in a team. They work better with the team, and then therefore the team gets better. So that's kind of the thing that I really want to push in the first place, and that's the most important thing. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that's becoming more the case now, isn't it? More highlighted, I suppose, in the team setting, is that we need, and players are crying out for that individual approach, even though we have got 20, 30, however many players that you deal with. Everyone's an individual positions, individual needs, individual injury histories and all the rest of it. So we are dealing with individuals within that team setting, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. And like, nobody has the same mental strength as like another player, you know, so you always have to take that into like calculation too, that like just the mental aspect of that whole thing is also as important as the physical aspect of it, of like the individual needs from like what you mentioned, an injury history, or just like the player's needs or player's athletic development, when you want to call it like that. And that's like one thing that a skier is really good at, or like especially the like competitive ski races, it's just like that mental aspect. They're so strong and they're barely breaking.
And I suppose the other thing with it is that with skiing, you've got the, when I say one performance day, I know you'll compete a number of times, but we're not competing every single weekend or twice a week, 3 times a week, sometimes like footballers. So I suppose there's something in that as well, isn't there? That I suppose any of the Olympic sports go through that cycle and then they have to perform at that time. And it's quite nice to pick out from those sports as well, isn't it? In terms of more, I suppose, more mentally than physically in terms of the preparation.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you see it like that, I mean, it's a huge difference if you have 90 minutes to make up for a mistake, or if you have 90 seconds to make up for a mistake, you know, or especially also like peaking. Probably a soccer player has to peak to the end of the season, and a skier, they kind of depends on how like good they are and what they want to achieve in the season. I mean, of course, they're all great. They really peak probably every weekend, and then they peak especially, I don't know how to like say it different than that, for a World Cup or like a World Championship or or the Olympics. So that's like super different in how you approach things. So yeah,
that they're the priorities then, aren't they? I suppose they're the cup finals in a football or a soccer format, whereas we're just having to constantly, like you say, football, we have to go right the way through the season, don't we? We have to continually perform. There's going to be times it's going to put more stress on players than others through busy fixture periods and all the rest of it. But it's just interesting learning from and looking at different approaches of different sports as well. Lorena, you mentioned, obviously we've said that you're at Bayern Munich. I think you mentioned before about the under-17s. What's your responsibility in terms of who are you directly working with at the club?
Well, I'm directly working with 2 U17 girls teams. So, which is basically, one is a proper U17 team playing in the first league in their age group, and the other one is more or less a development team, because here you don't have a U15 teams, or you basically only have a U17. But ours is actually kind of thought of as a U15, but they're also having a few older players that could also be a U17, but then they're playing competitively in a U17 league. So it's kind of the U17 and the farmers team over that. That's what I'm directly working for, but both all female athletes. Yeah.
Perfect. And I was going to ask, when you're working with the female player, the female soccer player, footballer, whatever we want to call them, what are some key considerations? So especially anyone that's listening to the podcast that might have worked in the men's game or even not worked in football before, and they're going to be starting working with female players, what would your advice be for them? Like, what are some key considerations that they need to think about in terms of the programming and working with players?
So the first thing, and probably one of the most important things, is especially when it's coming from a men's side to a women's side, is that the development overall is like probably a few years behind. So if you have, for example, an athlete who is 14 years old coming to my team, I'm probably the first person to ever teach them how to properly squat. So they never had that like athletic development from early ages on. So, and on the men's side, you have it with 10-year-olds or maybe sometimes even younger. So that's the thing you have to be aware of, that the athlete you're like coaching on a women's side is just a bit more behind in the development. It's not a bad thing. It's just they didn't have the chances when they were younger, because like they don't have the same chances. And then it's probably a lot of people have to get away from the fact that you have to like train female athletes different than men, so that you have to, I don't know, use different exercises or whatever. That's, in my opinion, that's completely like the wrong approach. So sometimes you have to be aware that a female body is different than a man's body or like a male body, but that doesn't mean you have to train them differently. So they can also squat, they can deadlift, they can use heavy weights, which is super important. They also can sprint the same amount that like their male counterparts can. But then you also have to be aware that, for example, during the menstrual cycle, that a female body is just acting a bit different in just that few, like in the weeks of the month. That sounds horrible, I'm sorry. But also, especially if it's a youth development, a female body is changing a lot more in like their teenage years than a male body does, and they're like also kind of getting to know their body more, or in a different way than they did a few years ago. So you have to be aware of that. And then also, it's girls, you know, they're like super easily influenced by everything that they hear from like all over social media, like all that Instagram crap. Sorry to say that. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that, but
you can
yeah,
swear.
all of that.
Go for it.
Don't tell it out loud. So yeah, you have to just create more of an awareness, probably, because they tend to be more insecure and more easily influenced by their outside environment than boys are.
And you mentioned before about and there's obviously a lot of female players that have been through like a full youth development program, and they'll get to 14, 15 or whatever, and they've had a good few years experience. When you get those girls in the gym, but then alongside them are also girls that are stepping into that environment for the first time, like you mentioned before, how easy do you find that to sort of get them both working at the right level? I've asked that really badly, but you get what I mean.
Yeah, I get it. So actually, I have to admit that that's not something I really had to work with a lot, because in Germany things work quite a bit different than they do in the UK. So we don't really have that youth development that you guys do. But I would probably go just from the way that I'm working with. So I keep my choice of exercise pretty basic. And first, when I meet a new player, I just want to see how they move. Of course, by like a test battery, but also then like I hand them a barbell and be like, okay, just go and do a squat. And then I go from there. So it's basically always the same like arrangement of exercises, and then you have like, of course, varieties when it comes to the weights that they're exposed to or whatever. But I want them to basically have like a ground, like a basic level of like things they can do, and I'm not pushing them further until like all of them have like that basic level. And if an athlete is a bit far behind, then I have to spend, of course, a few more like sessions or hours teaching them so that they get on that level. But then I can also go and be like, okay, if you're a more advanced athlete or if you're further in your development, please help me out and please help your teammates out, you know, just by also kind of instructing them how to do exercise that just helps them, which creates also a more positive environment within the team, but also creates that educational factor for the athletes so that they get more of an awareness of like their body, of their exercises while we're doing stuff, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I suppose it's what we refer to as like peer learning from your fellow players. And it's quite a powerful tool, that, isn't it? Especially when you've got influential players that are working or maybe getting good results in the gym. And they can learn a lot, can't they, from fellow teammates?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is the thing. That's also because we're not like always getting a new roster every year. So we have a few players that are with our team for like 3 years, and then we have new players coming up. And because of course they're kids, they interact with each other a lot easier. So they form new friendships or whatever. So they learn from each other in that way too, without me pushing. But that's also very beneficial, of course, for my work, because that makes a lot of things very easy. And then of course you have that like peak talents that are just so athletic, like so good, like athletic wise. And then they create that like competitiveness in the weight room. So they kind of always want to outlift each other. And that's also very beneficial for like their development without even trying to enforce it in that way, you know?
That's crucial as well, isn't it? I've seen so many great videos of coaches utilizing competitiveness with players, because they're all competitive, aren't they? When they're in a sport like football, they want to compete, whether it's out on the training pitch, whether it's in a stadium, or whether it's in the gym. And there's definitely, we need to utilize that as coaches, don't we? Not all the time, but there's definitely certain times that needs to be used, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And that also makes them more resistant, I think, when it comes to like performing in like a real competition, you know, like on the game. So when even if it's just like a little like catch play during warm up or something, competitiveness and like competing in like a game, even though it's a warm up, always helps fuel the minds and keep them more aware during the whole training session, because they have this like rise in attention when you just bring in that like little spike of competitiveness during training.
Yeah, 100%.
That's what like I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. You mentioned before as well about your screening process, or when you first get players into the gym or maybe into the squad. You talked about like an actual screening, but then also getting the player moving, getting them training. Can you break that down a little bit? Can you give us a little insight into your approach? Because I know a lot of people have different views on this. People have different approaches. I'll just be interested to hear what yours is.
Yeah, so the thing is, we don't really have a lot of time during the week, even if it's preseason. So we also don't really have a lot of time for proper testing. But like one of the key aspects that I always want to work on is the test that I'm doing right now actually giving me the information that I want to have, you know, like if I do 3 different tests and none of them tell me anything, it's just a waste of time, in my opinion. So right now I have this little test battery, which is basically a combination of movement screening that I can do with every athlete without any tools, basically, just on like what I see. And then it's like a core stability stuff, or like movement thing, again, just more focused on like core stability, strength, because that's really crucial in youth development too, because when they come in, they lack any kind of core control. If I don't really like the word core, so but just like upper body control and movement control. And then it's a few sprint exercises and 1 shuffle run. But I don't really like this like long endurance running things, because they're soccer players. They barely run 90 minutes in the same pace. So I just want to do a bit of like different distances with a bit of a cutting approach and all that. So what I'm doing in detail is I have like a squat movement screen. Then I have a thing that we call here, it's like shoulder taps. So it's basically an upper plank position, and it just go from like with your left hand to right shoulder and the other way. Then I have a short distance sprint, long distance sprint, an L drill, which I kind of stole from football, like American football, but it's really beneficial. I can absolutely recommend that drill. And then it's like a short shuffle run. And just by the way they move, you see a lot, especially when a players that just come to your team for the first time. And you can like do it with every athlete. It doesn't take a lot of time. It's maybe one training session. And probably every coach on that level is willing to give you that one training session, and you don't really need a lot of like all the fancy equipment. So it's just quick and easy, and also you can replicate that more. So it's easier to do it within the season more than if you need fancy equipment.
That's a great point. There's a lot of people in a similar situation as well that there'll be a few restrictions people are under in terms of finance, but also time. I think time's probably the main one, isn't it? And if you can get a process like that, how long would that take, do you think, to run a whole squad of players through?
So I always get the help of like everybody that's around me. So I get our head coaches, co-coaches, our physios in. So if we have like a full training squad, which is around 23 players, it takes up to like an hour, because they rotate, obviously. So we kind of set it up early and be like, okay, you coach, you do that exercises, and then they rotate. So it's more effective that way, but it's probably not more than 1.5 hours. At most. So if you consider warm up and everything in, which we do together, then it's maximum 1.5 hours, which is like one training session an hour, like at Bayern.
Perfect. And obviously this is data essentially that you can take forward and plan the program around increasing and trying to make those results or those numbers better, can't you? It's something really relatable. In terms of your position as a coach, like where do you think you can make the greatest impact with players at that age? So if we're talking like under 15 to under 17, that sort of age group, who are getting ready for essentially stepping into not far off being first team ready, where do you feel like you can make the greatest impact as a coach?
So I think the greatest impact I'm probably making is not it's not really on like the athletic part, but more of the like interhuman interaction. So one of my key focuses is actually educating them, as I mentioned before. So I want them to know why we're doing certain things and to create awareness for how they move and what is good for their body. So that is probably one of the key aspects, or like the most impact that I have. And then also on that, like how a relationship between a coach and an athlete can be. So probably some of my players will come for me at that. But I think I have a pretty good relationship with most of my players, because I'm like a super honest person, and I'm also super open. So my players can ask me anything. And I think especially when you want to stay in a sport on that level, you have to learn that you can trust your coach, and that it's not helpful when your coach is always like, okay, yeah, if you do mistakes, we're going to run laps all the time, which is like punishment, but also there's like interpersonal relationship between a coach and an athlete. So that's like the two main aspects that I probably have the most impact in. And then also like I'm developing a basis, but it's really complicated right now with COVID especially. So we don't make enough progress, or the progress that I want to make, or that we probably should make, but because of like restrictions. But yeah, so education and interhuman relationship, that's probably the most impactful for me.
And when I ask people that sort of question, that's a lot of the time the answer. I think
really?
Some people would expect it to be, oh, we do this type of squat or this type of speed work or whatever it is. But I think you're 100% with that. Like there's more to it than that, isn't there? Like they're the technical sides, whereas the personal side is massive, isn't it? As a coach, you've touched on there basically creating buy-in with your players and getting the backing and the trust. What about with coaches? So fellow coaches, so the head coach, physios, anyone else that you'll interact with at the club. Is that a similar sort of approach that you would take in terms of getting buy-in from those practitioners as well? Or is there anything else that sort of jumps out and you focus on?
Well, the thing is, I mean, I got lucky with our head coaches. So they're super easygoing and they know what they're able to do and they know what I'm able to do. And they know that what they're able to do is exactly what I'm able to do. So we don't really mix or headbutt. But as I said, I probably like an open environment more. So like communication wise. So I'm always probably an open person. Sometimes I'm a bit too honest, which probably doesn't go well with a few people, but I just want to have like a positive communication. So we don't really have this like clash of interests. But I'm not shy of telling them like what they're doing is it's not really what I want them to do. Or like when I have the feeling that they're interfering with my job. So there's boundaries, but there's also that like open communication that's for me and like really necessary if you want to create a positive environment. And also a coach is also a person who can learn, you know, like we always learn from each other. Like I learned from like listening to your podcast, or I learned from speaking to different coaches, and I also learned from speaking to our head coach, because the technical side is not what I'm best in, but I can also put that in good use for my work. And then also on the other hand, our head coach can use my work and like exercises I'm doing and things I want to teach the girls in his exercises. So we're always working with each other, learning from each other, developing with each other, and therefore growing the team to be better. So I think the basis of it all is just a good communication aspect and to have an open and honest conversation. And that's just like be like, oh yeah, everything is just perfect and we're also being nice to each other, but then behind the back we're just talking trash about each other. That's not what I do.
I think you've made a really good point there, because we talk about like relationships, communication, things like that all the time, but the honesty side of it is important as well, isn't it? Because we don't want to be, we always say about being yes men or yes women, where the head coach will ask you a question and you'll just agree and just say, yeah, I agree. Whereas you're there to support, aren't you? So if it's something that you don't agree with, or it's something that you think could be done better, that's the point to be brave, stand up and give your point across, isn't it? And that's obviously where you've built that buy-in and trust from the head coach or head coaches, because you've had the confidence to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. But also I know when to not overstep. Like sometimes it's better to just be quiet, because it's a thing that first of all will cause probably too much trouble or issue and you just don't want to handle it right now. But then of course it's probably sometimes it's smarter to not fight people on everything, even though you have a different opinion about stuff like that. 100%. You know, it's just, you probably want to add in a smart communication into that whole thing too. You know your position, know your like boundaries, because especially in a club, there's like a hierarchy. You know, you can't just always tell your opinion to the sports director. That will probably get you fired in a second. So yeah, just be smart about it, be charming about it, but also know your like point of view, know your position, and then also be willing to fight for it if it goes too far. You know, just it's a bit of a gray zone. There's not really a wrong or right or like a good buy-in advice or not. It always also depends a lot on the people you're working with. As I said, I get very lucky with the people I'm working with, but I can definitely imagine, and I definitely heard from other coaches, that I'm actually the lucky one, because they're having to fight a lot of harder battles than I have to.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, isn't it? And I think that comes down to experience, doesn't it? Knowing when to give your opinion and when to sort of sit back and stay quiet, or when to challenge something and when to just accept that, okay, that isn't the way I necessarily want it done, but I'll pick my battles. I'll decide not to go into this battle and I'll go into the next one. So Lorena, what I wanted to ask as well, which ties in a little bit into what we've been talking about, preparing youth players for the first team. Essentially, that's your job, isn't it? You're getting them ready to go into first team demands. Do you have any standards, any certain KPIs that we're trying to hit with those players? Is there anything in particular, or is it treating each individual as they come?
Well, it's probably very specific for each individual in the first place. But first of all, it's in my place, I'm not preparing them for our first team, because our first team is like super good, as you probably heard in the news or wherever. So the step would be way too big, but luckily we have a U20 team. So my job is basically to prepare them the best as possible to be able to play in our U20 team, which because of German regulations is also more or less a U19 team, so a pretty young one. I think we now have an average age of nearly, I think, 17 and a half years or something. So what my main goal is, or like my main KPI that I also communicate with the SC coach of our U20 team, is that they have to be able to do certain movement patterns. So they should be able to perform a squat and deadlift again, or like a variety of those. It's not really necessary that they have to like outlift everybody else. It's more about that they're actually able to do that, because in our U20 team, the standards and the use of the weight room and everything like that changes a bit. So they have a lot more accessibility to stuff than I do right now, especially. So I want them to be able to move so that they can take this like movement quality to the U20 and then develop their strength more when they're there. I mean, of course, it's always a different move when you load it than when you're not loaded, but I just don't want them to be totally non-movers at all. You probably know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then I want them to have like a basic speed, to be smart movers too. So especially when it comes to like cutting or change of direction, I want them to be able to move efficiently, especially in that, because that's also the difference on the pitch. Do you have to make one step more, or do you not have to do that one step more? So that's probably my main KPI. So move smart, move efficient. What's the English word?
Yeah, efficiently.
Efficient. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also move in a way you don't hurt yourself.
Yeah.
And when you achieve those KPIs, even when I'm working right now, you reduce this like injury risk and everything that comes with it. So, and then you can take that to the U20 and then maybe to our first team or to other like professional senior women's teams in Germany or outside of Germany.
Yeah, perfect. No, that's awesome. And then obviously you'll link up with the coaches at the under-20 team as well to update them on where players are up to and the sort of level, because I'm guessing some are going to be progressing quicker or be in different positions than others. Yes.
And also that communication, I think, is essential in youth development. So you have to pull on the same string. If the U20 team is pulling in a different direction than the U17 team, then the chances are like at a minimum that you are like actually efficient as like a club or as a team, in one way or the other, because in the end the goal is to have like a long-term athletic development. So if I say like in a drastic way, when you buy or like when you pull a player to your team, you want them to end up somewhere, and that is in our it's the first time it's a U20. But then when they're really, really good, it's like, okay, maybe they have a chance if they develop properly in the U20 to be in a roster for our senior team. So if you don't communicate within like your department, then that like plan for a player is technically thrown out of the window.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
Lorena, that's been brilliant to break that down. I think it shows a really good pathway that's happening at the club, and obviously where you fit into that as well. We'll move on to some of the quick fire questions now that we finish up with the podcast. So the first one being, who are some of the biggest influences on your career so far?
Okay, one of probably the biggest influences in my career right now is Evie Casagrande. Shout out to her. I probably pronounced her last name wrong, but I'm sorry.
I think you've nailed it.
So yeah, she's like a super big influence from the very first beginning. And then Nick Ward from Altus, really lovely guy, but we connect more on the skiing level of things. And then one of my really, really good friends that I have super good conversations with is Julia from White Lions Performance. So they are probably the 3 people that are most influential in my career, and also the ones that I know I can reach out to. And then of course I have some like people I often talk to, as Dave, who you had on the podcast last time on Wednesday. And of course some from my coaching environment whose opinions I really highly like yeah.
Yeah.
But Evie, Nick, and Julia are probably my top 3 to go to. Yeah.
All that have been on the podcast before, I'm pleased with that. I think Evie's one of the only that have got a hat trick as well, which is awesome. But 3 brilliant coaches there, some top practitioners. One thing I want to ask though, Lorena, you said you struggled understanding me at the start of the podcast before we were recording. How did you speak to David?
I have no idea. I struggle with it too, but I don't know. Like a good friend of mine is also Irish, so I kind of understand her, and that's where it's coming from. But it's really hard, and I kind of piece it together. I understand you slightly bit better than Dave.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
Dave. Next question. This is my favorite one. What would you say your biggest strength is as a practitioner?
God, that's a really tough one. I should have thought about that before. Over there. It's probably the way I am as a coach. So the way that I communicate with the girls, and then they might fight me on that, but I think I'm hilarious. No, but just it's probably really the way that I like do things, like probably my style of coaching, because everything else is just pretty basic because the basics work. So
yeah, great point. If there's any of the girls listening, let us know how funny Lorena is as well. You can reach out and let us know.
Oh God, I don't even want to know the answers.
I did say a few episodes ago, I need to start asking players that question about the coach before I get the coach on, just to see what they say, see if they agree or not. I might try that for a future episode.
I'd bruise my ego way too bad for that.
Or it might lift it up. You never know. It could be a positive, it could be a negative. Who knows?
They're super honest, so I'm scared.
Yeah, well, we'll see.
Yeah.
Final one. What is your approach to CPD or continued learning? Like, is there anything that sort of jumps out to you that you've maybe read, listened to, watched, a conversation that you feel has had a big impact on your practice?
Well, of course, first and foremost is the conversations you have with like fellow coaches, is also that like you kind of stay in touch with a lot of coaches, because when you grow that relationship, you always learn from each other, as I said before, and you talk like different conversations with the coaches when you're like more connected on a personal level. But then I looked it up earlier and I forgot, so my bad. I love Erin McLeod's podcast. So shout out to her. She's probably one of the best goalkeepers in the world, and she has this mindful project that's called, it's a lot about mindfulness and awareness, and her podcast is really good, so you have to give it a listen. She's also one of those who thinks that they're hilarious. She's probably funnier than I am. But yeah, shout out to Erin for that. And then it's about like always challenging yourself too, so like reading a lot of articles, but also then know what you're not good at or what you don't know, and then be willing to work on that. So it's a lot of reading, because there's always something that you don't know. So actually the things that you know, it's like that big, and then it's just a world full of things that you don't know. So always educate yourself no matter what. Like that's what I'm doing. So actually I signed up to do my CSCS right now.
Oh, awesome.
I always pushed it away because I kind of was like, yeah, I'm not sure if I want to do that or not, because it's kind of like, I have a feeling that it's not giving me a lot professional wise, but then I'm like, okay, like 80% of the people don't make it. So why am I like the ones that first of all don't try, and then why shouldn't I be like 20% that make it? So yeah, that's like my approach to things.
No, that's brilliant. No, that's top. Lorena, I always ask at the end of the podcast, if people want to reach out, if they want to ask you questions, if they want to get into conversations about certain topics, where would you direct them? Is it social media? Like, where would you say to go and shout you out?
Well, probably because my Instagram is private, because I kind of want to keep things a bit more private. It's easier to reach to me through Twitter. It's Lorena Sumser. So basically first name, last name, one word. But then also you can always like just DM me on Instagram, even though it's not private. I can always choose to reply or not, but I probably will reply. And it's Lorena S9. So yeah, or you just, I'm not sure. Did I give you my email? I'm not sure.
No, but it's up to you whether you want to say it or not, or people can just reach out through Twitter.
Probably Twitter and Instagram is easiest.
Perfect. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Lorena. I really appreciate you doing it. I think there's been some cool discussion points in there. And thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. I had a blast.
Perfect. Well, take care.
Take care, right?